On the second night, they pulled up beside the ruins of a town. Not much was left of it, but you could see that once there had been hundreds of houses. The concrete foundations, overgrown with weeds, lined up along curved streets. Here and there, a wall or a chimney was still standing. Casper stopped the truck just beyond the outer rows of ruins, and Maddie went around to the back and opened the trunk that held their dwindling supply of food. They had stopped beside a ditch where a trickle of water ran. It was green, scummy water, but Lena drank it anyway. It was all there was. Casper seemed especially grouchy. His pink face was splotched and damp, and his eyes looked inflamed. He had forgotten to twist his mustache into points, and it hung down at the corners of his mouth. He dug a crumbling traveler's cake from the trunk and glowered at Maddie. "What's the matter with you, anyway?" he said. "You haven't been very chatty lately." "I'm never chatty," said Maddie calmly. Casper took a savage bite of his cake. "It's like traveling with a tree stump," he said. "I thought you were going to be a pleasant and helpful companion." Maddie did not reply to this. She chewed serenely, gazing out over the acres of fallen houses. Lena realized there was a certain beauty in Maddie that she hadn't seen before. Her back was straight, she held her head high, and there was something unswayable in her. The bones of her face were strong, and her gaze was firm. There was nothing fluttery about her. You could see that Casper was finding out that she was not what he'd taken her for at first. She was more than he'd bargained for. On the third day, near evening, they saw a truck coming toward them from a great distance away. They were on a long straight road with a few trees or buildings to block their view. Just the dry brown grass and a few ancient fences leaning over and flocks of birds rising, swooping through the air and fluttering down again. Up ahead came this dark dot, toiling forward. In 20 minutes or so, the two trucks drew near. Lena stood behind Casper and Maddie, looking forward. This roamer looked poor. He had only one ox, a shaggy, sway-backed animal, and on his truck there were only 2 crates, not 4 as on Casper's. The man himself was almost as shaggy as his ox. His hair was long, and his beard lay like a hairy brown bib against his chest. As he came closer, he stood up on his truck and shaded his eyes with his hand, peering at them. "Watch out for this one," Casper said. "Could be a bandit. Looks bad and mean and dangerous." When the other truck was 20 or 30 feet away, its driver suddenly hauled on the traces. His ox veered, and the truck turned sideways so that it blocked the road. Lena couldn't tell if he'd done this on purpose. His movements were jerky, as if something was wrong with him. He climbed down from his truck and stood in front of it, his neck tucked down and his shoulders hunched as high as his ears. His eyes glittered in his hairy face. He stood there like that, saying nothing, waiting for them. Casper stopped the truck. He stood up and leaned forward. "Out of my way, you ragged wretch! Move that flea-bitten rig!" The roamer came a few paces closer. His mouth opened, a hole in the tangle of beard, but no words came out. Lena could see the back of Casper's neck flush deep red. "I said, out of my way." He snatched up his whip and sent the long lash curling out toward the man and snapped it a few feet from his face. The roamer let out a howl. He lurched toward them. All this happened in only a minute or so. Lena's heart was beating wildly. Was this a bandit? Was he going to attack them? She ducked down behind a crate and peered between the slats. Casper raised the whip again. "Come any closer and I'll cut you to shreds," he shouted. But before he could lash out, Maddie grabbed his arm. "Wait," she said. Casper tried to shake her off, but she yanked at him so hard he lost his balance and sat down again. "Why not find out what the man wants before you attack him?" she said. Casper struggled against her, but she was strong. She managed to wrench the whip out of his hand. Then she jumped down and confronted the other roamer, who had halted just in front of the truck. "What do you want from us?" she said to him, standing squarely in his path, her hands on her wide hips. "Why have you stopped us like this?" The roamer backed up a step. He looked at her with his mouth hanging open. He was grubby, Lena saw. His hands and his bare feet were nearly black with dirt. He mumbled something. Maddie bent closer to him. He mumbled again. She turned to Casper, who had climbed down from the truck and was approaching with his fists clenched. He says he's out of cakes. She turned back to the man. How long since you've eaten? The man stared at his hands. He had long, filthy fingernails. His fingers twitched. 3 days, he croaked. Just crumbs. 3 days. Well, said Casper, if you think we're going to supply you with food, you're very mistaken. Surely we can spare a couple of cakes, Maddie said. Boys and girls, this was such an important part. If your goal or focus was inferring character traits, we could infer a lot of traits about Casper and Maddie right now, just in the way that they've interacted with a stranger they've never met. So remember, when we infer what a character is like, we focus on what they say, we focus on how they act, we focus on their thoughts, and we also focus on how they interact with other characters in the story. So right now we can infer that Maddie is kind because she wants to help the stranger or the roamer. We can infer that Casper is angry and rude. We know that he's rude because he doesn't give the stranger a chance to explain why he stopped them. He also does not want to give any food to the roamer at all. So we could also say that maybe he's a little bit selfish, when Maddie has proved 2 times now in the story that she's selfless. So that's the opposite of selfish. She cares a lot. She wanted to help Maddie, or I'm sorry, Maddie wanted to help Lena, even though Casper did not want to help Lena at first. And now she wants to help the stranger, even though Casper does not want to help the stranger. Casper's face was dark red. We cannot, he said. We are on a special mission, extremely important. We need that food for ourselves, all of it. Lena thought this was unreasonable. He can have one of mine, she said. Ooh, boys and girls, Lena and Maddie are very similar. Now we can infer that Lena is also a very caring character. Casper whirled around. No, he said. You're going to need your strength. You're being ridiculous, said Maddie, but Casper reached out and pushed her. Back in the truck, he said, and you, turning back to the roamer, get your rattletrap out of my way if you want to stay alive. From the roamer came a sound that Lena had never heard before from a human being, a hoarse, hissing sound, as if he were spitting a stream of fire straight at Casper's face. He did this twice, and then he turned away and scuttled back to his truck. He pulled on the ox's traces, and it moved a few feet along, just far enough for Casper to drive his truck past it. Casper yelled at him one more time as he passed. You shouldn't be a roamer if you can't feed yourself. He cracked his whip at the man and drove on. So, I know a lot of you are probably thinking that Casper is very mean for not helping the roamer. I know that I definitely am. Think about what you would do if you were in that situation. Would you have helped the roamer? Why or why not? Would you have done what Casper did? How do you think you would have reacted? So that's something to think about. That's a connection that you can make and use as one of your Stop and Jots in your ongoing reading document or wherever you are recording your Stop and Jots. Lena climbed into a crate and sat with her head on her knees for a while after this. She was horrified by the starving, filthy roamer. How did he come to be in such a state? Was it his own fault? Was he a madman? But Casper could have given him something, couldn't he? Or were they so low on food that losing any of it really would harm them? Her stomach lurched. She felt queasy, but she didn't know if it was hunger or horror at what she'd just seen. That night, Lena woke up for a moment and heard the oxen making unsettled noises. She heard a creaking sound, too. But the sound stopped and she went back to sleep. In the morning, Maddie discovered they had been robbed. Well, well, she said, opening the food chest. Look here. What? Said Casper, who was wetting his mustache with spit and twisting it into points. Someone's been into our food, said Maddie. I wonder who. Casper jumped to his feet. Into our food? He didn't get much, Maddie said. Just 3 or 4, I'd guess. She put her hand in the chest and felt around. But he left us something. Sputtering with rage, Casper hauled himself up onto the truck. When he looked into the food chest, he let out a string of furious swear words. Lena crept out from under the blanket and stood up. What is it? She said. What happened? Our friend from yesterday has been for a visit, said Maddie. We wouldn't give him what he wanted, so he took it. And left something for us, too. Left what? Said Lena. Casper was shaking with fury. His face was dark red. Looks like dirt, said Maddie. I think he took what he wanted and dumped a bag of dirt on the rest. She wrinkled her nose. Might be some ox droppings in here, too. The skunk, Casper cried. The miserable rat. In my opinion, said Maddie, you should have given him a couple of cakes in the first place. I didn't ask for your opinion, said Casper. You're going to get it anyway, said Maddie, suddenly fierce. You turned a crazy old guy into an enemy in less than 2 minutes. You did it. You've done it over and over. I've seen you. You approach people like an enemy and bam, they turn into one, whether they were to begin with or not. It's my policy to be ready to defend myself, Casper said, scowling, at any moment. Fine, said Maddie. So now, because of your policy, we're out 4 cakes instead of 2, and we have a lot of dirt on the rest. She closed the chest, stood up, and glared at Casper with a mixture of anger and scorn. If you ask me, making friends is a better defense than making enemies. I didn't ask you, said Casper. So boys and girls, now we can think about theme. What do you think the author wants us to learn about life? Just in this chapter, the interaction between Casper, Maddie, Lena, and the roamer. Think about how Lena and Maddie acted. Think about how Casper acted, and then think about what the end result was. What happened because of the characters' reactions. On the 4th day, they went uphill hour after hour. The heat was terrible. The only water they found was at the bottom of a deep ravine. All 3 of them scrambled down, half stepping and half sliding, carrying Casper's biggest pots and sweating and gasping. They lugged the filled pots back up so that the oxen could drink. Then they went uphill some more. It was late afternoon by the time they came to the top of the ridge. Lena was so tired by that time and so hot that she felt like a boiled vegetable, limp and runny. That's a simile, boys and girls. She's comparing how her body feels to a boiled vegetable that's limp and runny. And our clue word is the word like. We know simile is a comparison that uses like or as. She was a bit dazed, too, only half awake, and so she was startled when the truck jolted to a stop and she heard sharp exclamations from Casper and Maddie. She jumped down and went around to the front. A tremendous view of land and water lay before her. Such immense water she had never seen. Green-blue, glinting in the rays of the late sun, white ripples racing across its surface. To her right, it stretched as far as she could see, but straight ahead she could see the shore on the other side. Green trees covering the ground and hills rising beyond. Boys and girls, I hope you're imagining that scene in your minds. That's another description of the setting. The bay, said Casper. This means we're almost there. We go around the end of it and then north. When do we get to the city? Lena asked. Tomorrow, said Casper. His wide face broke into a grin and he laughed his high, weird laugh. He opened and closed his fingers, stretching and gripping, as if he were imagining taking hold of something. We'll be there tomorrow, and then our work begins.